Okay, first, I would like to welcome everyone to this conference. I'm Bob Redwine. I'm a professor of physics at MIT and the leader of the Nuclear Weapons Education Project at MIT, and I'm a member of the program committee for this conference. The importance of working to reduce the threat of nuclear war has never been greater, as we know from recent and in some cases very recent developments in this country and in the rest of the world. I recall making a similar statement at a previous version of this conference. The state of truly strange times we are in. We do know that many of you spend a lot of your time working to achieve the goal of reducing the threat of nuclear weapons or nuclear war, and we want you to know how much. Our focus now is on the issues of not only the dangers of nuclear weapons and the difficulty associated with reducing or eliminating them, but also the problems associated with how much the United States is spending on maintaining and upgrading its nuclear arsenal. Certainly, as you will hear, our country has other needs that could benefit from this level. In that regard, I would like to remind people of a term that was in the past much more commonly used than it is now. That is the military-industrial complex. This was used especially during the Cold War to describe the collaboration between military units and commercial units to spend a great deal of federal funds on increasing military capabilities. The motivation of the military units was, of course, to increase their size and capabilities. On the other hand, the motivation of the commercial units was largely to make more money. It's very interesting to note that the term military-industrial complex was actually first introduced by President Dwight Eisenhower in his final remarks as president in January 1961. His purpose was to warn the nation of the dangers of this motivation based on money-making as he saw its influence steadily increasing. It is important to remember that this was a president who spent much of his career as a very senior military officer. He certainly knew a lot about the details of how the military-industrial complex operated and the dangers of it. While we do not hear the term military-industrial complex nearly as often as we used to, it is still very much part of our environment. Big reason facing the prospect of spending a huge amount of our resources on upgrading our nuclear arsenal is that some people stand to make a lot of money if we do so. This is by no means an appropriate justification for continuing to increase the dangers of the annihilation of all life on Earth, and our country must recognize this fact and act on it. It's notable that our first panelist, Bill Hartung, who I'll introduce in a minute, will focus on the military-industrial nuclear weapons complex. I'm sure that this conference will provide us very interesting and important information, and I am so glad that all of you are attending. Welcome from the organizers. Concerning this first session on continuing threats, Ted Postal and David Boris. Following their presentations, we should have time for some questions and discussion, and I will invite people to raise their virtual hands when the speakers are finished. I will now turn it over to Bill Hartung from the Quincy Institute, who will discuss the military-industrial nuclear weapons complex. Bill, it's all yours.
Yes, thank you. Well, here we are. Thanks to the organizers for bringing us together. I think, we need each other now. This issue is embedded in a moment where our democracy is a threat. People are being kidnapped and murdered on the streets. And we're seeing the kind of pushback in Minneapolis that needs to happen everywhere. So we have to bear that in mind, that our issue has to become part of a larger movement for democracy and really humanity. I'm going to talk about a chapter from my book, which I'm not plugging it, I'm just holding it up, The $1 Trillion War Machine. We call it the war machine instead of the military-industrial complex because it's some people, it's kind of an antiseptic term for some people. Some focus groups, people thought it was a building, like a housing complex or something. And since we've been at war for as long as I can remember, war machine seems like a more appropriate um, moniker. So we're at a crossroads now. As you know, the New START treaty could expire next week without last-ditch action by the Congress or the president. And in the meantime, there's this huge enthusiasm and boatloads of money going into a useless, provocative Golden Dome system alongside a buildup of a new generation of nuclear weapons that could cost $1 trillion in this decade. So how did we get here, and what do we do about it? That's not a 10-minute task, but I'll make some observations. You know, when Eisenhower coined the term military industrial complex, a lot of it had to do with nuclear weapons issues. The contractors in the military wanted him to buy a bomber he did not think was necessary. Although he was the commander in chief, many of the officers were speaking out of school, saying he was depriving us of an important asset for not building the bomber. Then there was the ginned up missile gap, where they tried to make it seem like Eisenhower had made us fall behind the Soviet Union in ballistic missiles, when in fact the U.S. had a huge lead over the USSR in that respect. And back then it was the birth of the nuclear triad, which in some circles is viewed as sacred, launching missiles from bombers, from submarines, from land-based missiles. In fact, that was a bureaucratic fight where the Navy and the Air Force were fighting over who could get the biggest piece of the nuclear pie. So the Air Force had the ICBMs and the bombers. The Navy managed to put them on submarines. And then they had rival doctrines of which was better. You know, the Navy said, well, we should attack population centers. And the Air Force said, no, we need accurate missiles like ours to go after, their weapon systems. And they actually sort of ginned up their own doctrines and went shopping them on the Hill and in the public. Finally, the Air Force got the right to control targeting, which has a lot to do with what kind of weapons you might build. And one of the admirals said of the Air Force, they're worse than the communists. You know, they're sneaking around behind our backs. They're trying to put us out of business. So this notion that the triad was, sure, there was strategic discussion, but the real driving force was money and bureaucratic politics. And that's why ICBMs, which I think we're going to hear about, the most dangerous weapon in the arsenal, are completely unnecessary, other than a profit center for Lockheed Martin and support for some military bases in a handful of states. The nuclear lobby is quite powerful. There's a Senate ICBM coalition, senators from the states that have bases, North Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, and where a lot of the work is being done to maintain the old and build the new in Utah. And those 8 senators have been different parties, different times, but they've managed, for example, to put a rule into law that you can't go below 400 ICBMs in the arsenal. You can't even destroy old silos in case they might be used again. You can't do a study of what would be a better way to go about this environmentally, economically, or otherwise. So they've had a stranglehold. And of course, Northrop Grumman and the companies that make these things have spent a lot of money on lobbyists, on campaign contributions, and also in the local areas that are giving them the support to keep this whole system going. And it also, this pork barrel politics element distorts our ability to have rational discussions about these things. Congress appointed a commission, a strategic posture commission, a few years ago, and their final report was presented to the Senate Armed Services Committee. It was an awful report. It was back to the Cold War. It was multi-warhead ICBMs. It was more tactical nuclear weapons. It was hinting at should we resume above ground testing. And the majority of the members of that commission had links to the nuclear weapons industry. One would think that the Senate, the alleged deliberative body, would ask questions about strategic posture. Most of the discussion was about weapons built in the senator's state. You know, Senator from Arizona said, well, you know, our state makes a missile that can intercept hypersonic missiles. Senator from Nevada said, we need to spruce up what used to be called the Nevada test site. Senator from Alabama said, well, we make everything. I mean, we're the more the merrier. Finally, Senator Warren, to her credit, said, what's this all going to cost? And the co-chair of the committee, who was a former lobbyist for Northrop Grumman, said, oh, cost is no object. This is too important. And so that was what passed for a debate about a consequential issue of how much the future of humanity depends. It was all about the money. And so that, of course, has to stop. And I think the introduction of Golden Dome makes it even worse because although Golden Dome certainly cannot provide a leak-proof defense, it will flood the zone with money for contractors large and small. And in some circles, it's people, if they can make people believe it might work, it's kind of a substitute for doing the real work, which is getting rid of nuclear weapons. And furthermore, they want to put interceptors in space, which would make that a potential zone of conflict where we've got very vulnerable satellites. So the whole push is obviously in the wrong direction. We've dealt with things like this before. When Reagan came in, joked about the bombing starting in 5 minutes, had a huge nuclear buildup, but he was turned around by a movement, the Freeze movement, European nuclear disarmament movement, films like The Day After. It's harder to do that now. I mean, The Day After was seen by tens of millions of people. Now you need a whole ecosystem of tools and cultural products to fill all the different information sources that people use. And we, as I said at the outset, we need to connect with this larger movement. If our democracy is a threat, if some people say we're creeping into fascism, then we have to be part of that. There's various kinds of existential threats. There's nuclear weapons, there's climate. But if you're afraid your kid's not going to make it back from school without being shot, that's an existential threat to you, or putting food on the table, or this whole array of things. So somehow we have to learn more about each other's primary issues. We have to knit together a larger movement, and we have to take the kind of risks many of us may have taken before, given what's at stake. So I think the nuclear movement has to rise, but it also has to rise with the larger movement for democracy, peace, justice, and against authoritarianism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. As I said before, when the three speakers are finished, we will allow people to raise their virtual hands and we'll have some discussion. Our next panelist is Ted Postal, who's a professor in the program of Science, Technology, and Society at MIT, who will discuss the fallacies of the Golden Dome project. It's all yours, Ted. You are muted, Ted.
Sorry to take your time with all this experience with Zoom, which keeps changing. In any case, I'll talk briefly about what Golden Dome is, but I'll start out by giving you some basic information about, if I can get it. This is something else. I really am sorry for this. Oh, here we are. All righty. Can you see my slides?
It looks like you've started screen sharing.
Now click share.
Click share.
There we go.
There we go.
Are you on? You got it?
Yeah.
Okay, great. The issue with Golden Dome is multifaceted. The system is not just extraordinarily expensive, potentially a cost of tens of trillions of dollars, literally a significant fraction of the gross domestic product. But more importantly, it's destabilizing on a fantastic level. There's nothing I have seen in my experience analyzing nuclear weapon systems that come close to as destabilizing as this system. There's basically no existing ground-based anti-satellite system that could be nearly as capable as what Golden Dome can be in terms of its reach to multiple altitudes and to its firepower. In particular, as it is beginning to be deployed, it could, in theory, essentially destroy all of the high-altitude, militarily sensitive satellites of both Russia and China in its very early stages of deployment. This is a threat that Russia and China will certainly not allow, and the kinds of things that one cannot predict but could happen could readily disintegrate into a confrontation leading to nuclear war. A small number, it's also extremely vulnerable to countermeasures, in addition to its extraordinary cost and instability. You could easily cut holes in the constellation so that ICBMs could be launched essentially unopposed. I'll talk about that when I describe the system. And it could, the attempts by China and Russia to negate the deployment of Golden Dome could easily result in a phenomenon called Kessler syndrome, which I'll describe very briefly, where there's enough debris in low Earth orbit that we cannot launch, nobody could launch satellites into low Earth orbit. So in other words, the debris density would be high enough that anything put into low Earth orbit would have such a short lifetime in orbit before it's being hit by a piece of random debris that the low Earth orbit would essentially be unusable. That's, of course, has tremendous commercial as well as military implications. All right, let me tell you a little bit about how it's supposed to work. It's a satellite constellation. You should be able to see my cursor. Is that right? Can you see my cursor? Or maybe not. This shows a depiction of a very small constellation of 288 satellites, each of which would have, at least one interceptor associated with it. In reality, the density, the disks here show you sort of a rough estimate of the range within which an ICBM launch from the surface of the Earth could be engaged. As you can see, there are lots of open holes in this. And you basically, there's a general agreement among analysts that you need between 1,000 and 1,500 of these satellites. So 4 or 5 times more satellites than what are shown, than what are depicted in this diagram. Now, the way the system works is you would have a satellite alerted to a launch at maybe 1,000 kilometers or 1,200 kilometers downrange from the actual location of the satellite when it's alerted of a launch. So there's got to be satellites deep in space, typically at geosynchronous orbits, 40,000 kilometers, and they're looking down at the Earth and they see a launch at a location which is maybe 1,000 or 1,200 kilometers downrange from an actual satellite. It takes a little while. You have to track the ICBM initially. It takes some time because it's not moving very fast. And so it takes some time to get enough data to know where it's going because you have to predict a potential intercept point. And then after maybe 20 or 30 seconds, you would launch an interceptor. Interceptor might have a speed of 5 kilometers per second. These are numbers that are general. We can talk about it later if people have detailed technical interests. But the satellite and the interceptor are traveling along at 8 kilometers per second. And if the engagement takes 100 or 120 seconds before an actual intercept occurs, it's going to occur at, 1,000, 1,200 kilometers away from the actual launch location in orbit of the satellite. This is just shown in the next diagram. What I show here is a satellite that is engaged at an ICBM launch that begins at this location I'm pointing to here. And it shows you the time, the start of the engagement and the time it takes for the satellite and the interceptor to move in orbit to a location where the intercept can occur. So this is a dynamic situation. Now, keep in mind, let me just go back up, that a single, you need 1,200 satellites in order to engage a launch of a single ICBM anywhere on the surface of the Earth. So, for example, if I have two ICBMs launched from a single location, then I need twice as many satellites or twice as many interceptors. I may need two interceptors per engagement. In fact, I would almost certainly, if we're talking seriously, need two interceptors per engagement. So I'm going to need many more interceptors because of that. So we very quickly get to satellite interceptors numbers of 100,000 or 150,000 satellite interceptors, for example, for a launch of 100 ICBMs. 100 ICBMs is a very reasonable number for a potential launch that would have to be engaged, because ICBMs are typically in silo fields and collected together, and they're typically many more than a few hundred, than 100 ICBMs. So you can have, this system could go into tens of trillions of dollars to theoretically have the capability. It doesn't necessarily mean it would have the capability. So it's also important to note that the Golden Dome, the satellite portion of the Golden Dome, is only a piece of the general Golden Dome, because the concept as described, I won't say defined, as described by Trump, is also an expansion of the existing missile defense system, this ground-based missile defense system. This is not a discussion for here, but the ground-based missile defense system will never work. And I want to underscore, this is not a technical point I'm making. This is a basic scientific point, but I won't go into that here, but I'd be pleased to do that in a future talk. So the next problem is the anti-satellite potential of the Golden Dome. So the Golden Dome is supposed to be built as a defense system against ICBMs. But if you look at what its real capability will be very quickly, is as an anti-satellite system. And the anti-satellite system will be of overwhelming capability. And the reason for that is very simple. If you have a 5 kilometer per second interceptor, and it has to be that in order to shoot down at the Earth and reach an ICBM before it no longer can engage in powered flight, then you can take 2.5 kilometers of that, or even 5. And if I take 2.5 kilometers of that and I just drive the interceptor along its direction of motion in its satellite path, I can be to the highest altitudes in just a couple of hours. And at these altitudes, this is geosynchronous. This is an orbit where the satellite rotates around the Earth at the same rate the Earth rotates. So the satellite appears to be stationary above the ground. And they're early warning satellites, critical navigation satellites, which are half that altitude. These are geosynchronous satellites, the semi-synchronous, the ground global positioning satellite systems, the Russian GLONASS system. And these are critical for navigation. Now, we all know them because we use them for driving around, but these are also critical for guiding missiles, for guiding ships, submarines, all kinds of military operations. So they are absolutely critical to the military operations of the United States and their counterparts in Russia and China. So attacking these systems preferentially with a few dozens of these interceptors, not hundreds of thousands of them, but a few dozens of these interceptors, could potentially cripple both China and Russia in terms of their satellite military, most sensitive military satellite capabilities. They are not going to allow this to occur. How they go about stopping this is a long discussion. So you have a highly provocative system from the point it's being deployed. Forget about when it ultimately gets deployed. Then finally, it's vulnerable to anti-satellite attacks from the ground. This just shows you a vertical orbit that can be reached by the interceptors that are deployed as anti-missile interceptors on the Aegis ships. They can go vertical. Notice they're well over 1,000 kilometers. The satellite orbits are 400 kilometers because they have to be close to the Earth. So really rather small interceptors could be used. This is an example of the missile defense interceptors on the ships, but a much smaller interceptor could be used and launched from airplanes. And so what you would do is just punch a hole in the constellation downrange of the location where you want to launch your missiles. The hole, of course, there would be no satellites in that hole. When that hole passes over your ICBM field, you launch your ICBMs. Very straightforward. And but in doing this, you are going to cause a phenomena. You may cause. We don't know enough about this, but it's well studied. Is you can create enough debris in orbit when you hit a satellite, you just shred it. It just becomes, and the debris in low Earth orbit is very large. And if you get to if you add to that debris in a substantial way, there will be so much debris. And this is real. This is not science fiction. You can get to a density of debris. These are like small particles, like the size of a bolt, smaller. And they're traveling at 8 kilometers per second. Collision speeds can be 15 or 16 kilometers per second. So these 3 kilometers per second results in the release of kinetic energy equal to its weight in TNT. Some of you may remember there was a paint fleck, a fleck of paint that came off something that hit the shuttle's windshield, and it left a big pock in the windshield, even though it was just no more than a fleck of paint. So this could result in the exclusion of low Earth orbit for all kinds of applications, both military and otherwise. I'll stop here, though. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Otherwise, it's a good choice.
Are there arguments for it?
Yes, there are none that I could find, but
Well, thank you very much.
I don't work in Washington, so I'm just not smart enough.
So we will move on now to the final panelist in this session. Again, remind people there will be opportunity to ask questions at the end of the session. But the final panelist is David Boris from Chicago Peace Action, and he will discuss the dangers from the new Sentinel ICBM. It's all yours, David.
Thanks, Robert, and thanks so much for asking me to participate on a panel with such esteemed panelists as Bill Hartung and Ted Postel. Jonathan asked that I address dangers of the new ICBMs, and I suspect most of my remarks here are agreed upon by the majority of our attendees, but I hope I might contextualize this in a way that will resonate with folks who have not paid as much attention to this matter as my fellow panelists, and most importantly, open a space where we can talk to friends and neighbors of the clear and present danger the development of the Sentinel missile represents within this dangerous new nuclear arms race. In this moment, there's a growing percentage of Americans who are somewhat aware of the pending expiration of New START on February 5th, the last remaining treaty controlling the arsenals of the two most nuclear-armed nations, the United States and Russia. And we know that 69% of the American electorate, including 64% of Republicans, believe that nuclear weapons possession actually make the world less safe. And 91% of Americans believe the US and Russia should adhere to the current limits of New START or further reduce their arsenals. So faced with and buttressed by such significant public support, why in the world are our elected representatives in DC allowing the creation and eventual development of an entire new generation of nuclear weapons in general, and of the most dangerous and unstable leg of the overall arsenal, land-based ICBMs? Well, we could begin by understanding that this is not an administration that thinks geometrically. They see the world through a dangerously narrow lens of linear thinking. And that is the quintessential flaw in such a hubristic attitude toward the rest of the world. The danger that such linear thinking brings upon this situation is the belief that they act in a static world when that's a fantasy. That is, they believe that their actions are not subject to the dynamic environment in which they occur, and thus are oblivious to the fact that other nations act simultaneously in their own self-interest, quite often in ways this administration did not calculate before taking their own action. Simply put, the Trump administration is playing checkers in a world that is often engaged in three-dimensional chess. So it doesn't take a genius to see the absolute danger of thinking like this when applied to nuclear arsenals. Let me also call out the utter madness and myopic poor judgment of our government in 2010 when it undertook a 30-year, then $1.7 trillion nuclear modernization program that has triggered what is rapidly becoming an all-out hell-bent for leather, now trilateral new nuclear arms race. I might point to the hypocrisy of the nation that drafted the NPT in 1968 and obligated itself under Article 6, along with the then 4 other acknowledged nuclear-armed nations to, quote, pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to the cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament. But I do not think we can fully address both the hypocrisy and lunacy of building a completely new class of intercontinental ballistic missiles without questioning the sanity of stockpiling and deploying fixed-in-place nuclear-armed intercontinental ballistic missiles in the first place. Let me take a short step back to just a little more than 5 years ago. On Friday, January 22nd, 2021, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons came into force as international law. There was great hope that this could be the catalyst forward and perhaps establish momentum for an ultimate path to zero. Lending credence to this hope was that our newly elected President Joe Biden was on record more than a few times during the campaign stating that he would make a formal no first use declaration that could perhaps be the first step toward Barack Obama's stated vision and famous 2009 declaration in Prague. Quote, I state clearly and with conviction America's commitment to seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons. And the first step toward such a comprehensive plan, well, that appeared obvious to everybody who was thinking about it. Of the 3 legs of the US and Russia's nuclear triad, all experts, and I really do mean all experts in nuclear weapons policy, agree that the most dangerous and unstable leg of the triad are fixed-in-place, land-based ICBMs. They are, by their very fixed-in-place status, completely vulnerable to a preemptive first strike, so vulnerable that they're often referred to in nuclear policy circles as a sponge, meant to absorb an enemy's first strike. Of course, the illogic of this is if you wanted to have a retaliatory capacity on land, you would need to launch those missiles between the time of first warning and the moment of impact, somewhere between 19 and 26 minutes. Whether you look at Annie Jacobson's nuclear war scenario or the recent Bigelow movie, House of Dynamite. This vanishing small window of time gives a US president who has sole authority to decide to, as the term is used, use them or lose them, and leaves the fate of the world hanging in the balance of those few minutes and the mental, emotional, and spiritual stability of a single human being. And so the obvious first step is to eliminate the program scheduled to replace those 400 Minuteman missiles, the Sentinel missile, and then begin to dismantle the entire land-based leg unilaterally, and in so doing send a clear signal to a nervous China and our old nuclear adversary Russia that we mean to make good on the spirit of that 2009 Prague speech and begin to inject some mature sanity into the paradigm of arms control. Unfortunately, we're moving in the opposite direction and only further compromising our credibility with the world community, especially the over 6 billion people who live in nations that don't possess nuclear weapons. In the last year of his life, I heard Daniel Ellsberg say on more than one occasion, the possibility of a nuclear detonation by design, miscalculation, or accident is not 0%. It's not even close to 0%. And we know that the universal laws of physics and mathematics will tell you that anything that is not impossible is ultimately inevitable. Our 80-year history of nuclear weapons possession is replete with example after example of misunderstandings, accidents, and Cold War fear where we just barely escaped a major exchange of thermonuclear weapons. And now we increase the opportunities for misjudgment by at least 50% or more as we add China to the mix, a nation with whom we have zero history of nuclear arms treaties or negotiations. By a stroke of luck, or the right person being in position to exercise proper judgment in the moment, or by cooler heads at the top restraining their initial instincts, we've avoided the apocalypse. But that should not and cannot be counted on to last forever. I took my degree from the University of Nevada in Las Vegas. I must tell you, I know a little bit about winning streaks. They don't last forever. It's a mathematical impossibility. We have been the beneficiaries of a fantastically long winning streak with respect to nuclear weapons. It won't last forever. If we continue to add bullets to the chamber of the revolver we hold to our heads and the heads of the world population in this lunatic game of nuclear Russian roulette, our luck will run out, and we won't get a second chance to get this right. In the opening of the 2003 movie, The Fog of War, former Defense Secretary Robert McNamara says, "Every general will tell you that a mistake in war costs lives. And so the conventional wisdom in warfare is don't make the same mistake twice. Learn from your mistakes." But he goes on and says, but there will be no learning period with nuclear weapons. You make one mistake and you're going to destroy nations. And now that we understand nuclear winter, we know that we will destroy more than just the belligerent participants. Will functionally destroy human civilization across the planet, and we won't get a second chance. Thanks. I look forward to the Q&A, and thanks again for bringing us all together.
Thank you, David, and the other panelists. If you do have a question, please raise your virtual hand. While people are doing that, I did notice a question in the chat that Cheryl Spencer raised. I don't know whether you can, this is for Ted. I don't know whether you see it, but let me just read it. Is it that the sensing satellites can only see a flying ICBM when its engines are operating, which happen only for a few minutes and then they turn off? So this very small window is the main limiting fact about the feasibility of the Golden Dome?
Well, the fact that they can only see the problem is that you have to, since the high altitude missile defense, the ground-based missile defense, is overwhelmingly vulnerable to the most simple decoys, literally a balloon. The system cannot tell the difference between a balloon in space. At the altitudes this operates, there's almost no aerodynamic drag. So a balloon deployed from a missile will travel along with a warhead. So a balloon of a few ounces will travel along with a warhead of, hundreds or even thousands of pounds. And the balloon radiates in the infrared, which is how you look, how you see. You can't track these things without infrared sensors on the kill vehicle because radar is not powerful enough to operate at those ranges from an interceptor that's limited in size. And so when the interceptor looks to home, it just sees a bunch of infrared radiating points of light. It has no way of knowing the difference between one point of light and another. So it can't tell the difference between decoys. So this system is fundamentally not capable of functioning. So the Golden Dome has to destroy the missiles rising from the Earth before they complete their powered flight and deploy warheads and decoys. That's the purpose in theory, of course. In practice, it may not work. In theory, you have to destroy the missiles while they're in powered flight. It turns out that the current systems we have can only see the missile in powered flight, but that's adequate. It's inadequate for all kinds of other reasons, but they are capable. They have fantastic capabilities, and at least our systems do. A second issue, which is different but important for people to be aware of, is that the Russians do not have this capability. That's a long story, but it's important because the Russians don't have the early warning capacity that we have, the United States, and they are very nervous about U.S. Offensive capabilities. So there is a real danger of an accident due to the Russians' very short warning time, which is limited by the line of sight of radars, because the Earth is round and the radars see in a straight line, and they potentially don't have 20 minutes or 15 or 25 minutes. They potentially have 5 minutes, 6 minutes of warning, and that is intolerable. And they have taken measures to deal with that, like pre-delegating launch of their systems if a nuclear attack kills their leadership. So it's a very dangerous situation.
Ted, I think we should move on to other questions.
I'm sorry, didn't mean to.
Thank you. I see a question from Sharon Abreu.
Hi, yeah. I just, I live in the state of Washington, and a bunch of us have been pushing back against legislation that is to build a whole bunch of small modular nuclear reactors. And I wonder if you could speak to the relationship between the nuclear waste from such reactors and the creation of nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Do you have a particular person you're addressing the question to?
No?
Okay. Panelists?
Well, I think you could say that a nuclear reactor basically is a breeder of plutonium. And plutonium can be chemically separated, so it's not as difficult to obtain as enriched uranium. And it's a problem. The potential flooding of the world, not just with plutonium, which is one of many of the radioactive byproducts, but plutonium is a weapons material. And if you're going to burn uranium-238, unless you have thorium reactor or something like that, but if you're going to burn uranium-238, which is what most reactors do these days, you're going to have a proliferation problem, period.
Okay, thank you. Are there other questions from the audience? I do see one other in the chat. His question was, what is the status of START and possibilities for renewal? Would anyone like to address that?
Well, next week it's going to lapse. People are putting on a last-ditch push, as we should, to Congress and the president. If it lapses, the fallback is, would there be a pledge to observe New START limits, more or less a handshake deal? But public opinion, National Nuclear Threat Initiative has found overwhelming majorities of across the spectrum want the United States to have some sort of guardrail, some sort of treaty governing nuclear weapons between the U.S. and Russia. So the question is, do we have to start over, or can we save some of what's here and build on it?
Okay. Thank you, Bill.
Maybe I should add that Putin has told the United States that the Russians will abide by START for the next year. And if for the United States, the idea is to allow the time to renegotiate or readjust the treaty for the current situation.
I think we have maybe one more question.
And we haven't responded. We haven't responded.
Right. From, I think Jan Boudart was the first one on the list.
Thank you for calling on me and for having this discussion. I have a two-part question, but the parts are related. And the first is, please compare the difficulty of ending nuclear power with the difficulty of ending nuclear weapons. And the related question is, please discuss Emmanuel Macron's opinion that nuclear weapons and power are dependent on each other. Basically, without nuclear power, there can be no nuclear weapons, and vice versa.
If one of the panelists could address that, that's fine. Then we'll have to end this session.
Well, if someone else wants to talk, it's fine. If you need to produce a lot of lightly enriched uranium, low enriched uranium to run a nuclear reactor. The dirty little secret about uranium enrichment is that most of the enrichment capacity in what's called separative work units is required to just get low enriched. Getting to higher enrichments only require modest levels of additional separative work units. And to run a reactor, I don't have the numbers at my fingertips at the moment, but you're talking about the capacity to build hundreds of plutonium-based atomic bombs with the enrichment capability you need to run a reactor for a year. So it's true that technically they are intertwined. So if you want to separate the problem, it has to be a political decision. It has to be an international law that people abide by and that's enforced. If you think that nuclear power is important, and getting rid of it is another discussion, the complexities of our energy future.
Well, thank you very much. I know there are a few other questions, but I'm going to turn this over to Jonathan King, who will be chairing the next panel.
All right. Well, thanks for those excellent, scary, somewhat terrifying presentations. It's clear that a feature of these weapon systems we just heard about is their enormous costs. Updating the three arms of the nuclear weapons triads cost trillions of dollars over the next decades. And those are taxpayers' dollars. But very, very, very few Americans realize how much of their income tax dollars that they send to Washington every year are diverted into buying new weapons. No arm of the government, not the executive branch, not the Congress, not the judicial branch, has responsibility or does communicate back to taxpayers how their tax dollars are spent. So the average American doesn't know that more than half their tax dollars go to weapons. That, of course, is a very conscious policy of the military-industrial complex to keep the taxpayers in the dark about how much this costs. Now, luckily for us, there are a few stalwart defenders of the public's right to know, and among them is our next speaker, Debbie Weinstein. In her years at the Coalition on Human Needs, she has continuously pulled back the curtain to reveal the actual dimensions of the congressional discretionary budget, that is, the budget that's voted each year by the Congress. And she's joining us today to give us a short summary of that key knowledge. Then after that, I'll introduce our two other speakers. Debbie, take it away.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Yes, we are really turning from heart-stoppingly apocalyptic, extremely important presentations to one, in my case, brutal grinding spread of militarism in our daily lives, and absolutely the choices that we make, and the money that we're talking about, there are some commonalities in terms of what's driving what you just heard about and what you're about to hear about. So let me share my screen if I can do that.
There you go.
Let me just get the slideshow thing.
We see it.
Yep. Okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. As I say, this is a little different presentation from some of the ones I've given over the years because some of what we're facing is chillingly different. So bear with me. I'll start with this thing that many of you are well familiar with, how very much money we do spend on our military as compared to other nations. I think most of you who are participating know that. You've just heard about how much more it could be if we're not paying attention. Now, there are massive efforts to expand the military, some of which you just heard. Some of it, before we get to the apocalyptic levels, which I hope we never do get to, we did pass in what we at the Coalition on Human Needs call Big Brutal, that piece of legislation that passed last summer that made huge tax cuts favoring the wealthiest, also made some pretty big militaristic expenditures. So we find in something that hadn't really been done before, not only are we seeing the annual appropriations for the military, but they got a 10-year additional infusion, about $150 billion over 10 years, but most of it is being received a lot earlier. So that's defense, but that's not the only thing. And some of this is the newer stuff that I wanted to make sure you were aware of. So in this listing of the basic overview of what happened in Big Brutal, you see this 150 billion additional for defense, but we also see a close amount of increase for homeland security and anti-immigrant enforcement. In addition, of course, and you've probably heard a lot about the gigantic cuts in human needs programs, more 1.4 trillion dollars in decreases, huge increases, close to not so far off from $1 trillion for Medicaid and Affordable Care Act cuts, student loan cuts, other education cuts, you'll hear more about that, and SNAP nutrition program cuts. So some increases in that in spending in the militaristic side of things, and gigantic cuts in human needs programs. We've also heard, we've hardly seen the least of it. President Trump announced that he'd like his next year's budget to jump from approximately $1 trillion now for the Department of Defense to 1.5 trillion. That's a lot. You've all been given reasons, and we'll hear more about why we have to work together to oppose that. But on our streets, that is the new dimension that we're all seeing. Of course, it's in the news. It's shocking. I don't have to tell you about the deaths of Renee Good and Mr. Preto, we have a lot to fight against. A lot of that was made much more possible by those big, brutal increase in the Department of Homeland Security. So increased detention, $45 billion, Customs and Border Protection, $12 billion. You can see there all of these increases. For ICE, which of course you've seen them, as well as Customs and Border Protection on the streets in Minneapolis and in other places, look at the increase in spending for ICE, which was made possible by those big, brutal increases. What are they doing? They've got so much money, they've got $50,000 signing bonuses for ICE agents. How many of you working in the education area perhaps are aware of $50,000 signing bonuses for teachers or home care workers? Our priorities are very screwed up. Nothing like the tens of trillions that you just heard about, but still it's important to know that these incursions of the military are on our own streets in 6 cities from June through December of last year, cost almost $500 million, another $93 million a month for similar deployments. You get the picture. This is another kind of cost. And one of the big costs is a tremendous increase in detention. And this is a commonality from a lot of the impetus from what you've heard about. Private corporations are benefiting from these kinds of expenditures. We're seeing an increase because of the funding that's been appropriated that from last December, last December we had nearly 59,000 in ICE detention, a big increase from the year before, and expected around now to be up to about 100,000. And private prison corporations are profiting from that. Core Civic, they run that Dilley, Texas facility where the 5-year-old boy and his father were taken that you've read about. Their profits are going way up because of all the private facilities they are expanding. The Geo Group, which is ICE's largest contractor, their profits are going up as well. I just threw in this slide. This is a factor across our militarism. The Pentagon budget contractors, more than half of the Pentagon budget. At the same time, these are the costs of all of that. That kind of increase plus the huge increases in tax breaks, and who's paying? We're paying because of nearly $1 trillion in cuts to Medicaid, Medicare, the Affordable Care Act, leaving 15 million uninsured. We're having huge cuts to the SNAP nutrition program, more than 5 million people likely to lose their benefits altogether. Over 40 million people will at least see significant reductions, very likely. You'll hear more about education cuts in a minute, so I won't emphasize that. But be aware of the choices Congress has made. All of these expenditures, but they couldn't manage to expand the Affordable Care Act premium tax credits. 4 million will become uninsured because of that. And that has great bearing not only on the people who lose their insurance, but it will hurt the economies of places all across the country. loss of state and local taxes, loss of jobs. This analysis, close to 340,000 jobs lost because of this. So we know that on the domestic side, the real value or expenditures on domestic and international programs fallen by nearly 10% below the levels in 2019. We know there are urgent needs. I don't have to tell you our tremendous shortage of affordable housing. This stat, on average, a one-bedroom apartment, a modest one-bedroom apartment would require an hourly wage of more than 28 bucks an hour, and almost half of all US workers earn less than that. Millions upon millions, almost 23 million low-income renters pay more than half their income on rent, and of course, large numbers of homeless people. Only 1 in 7 eligible children get child care subsidies, while home heating costs are up a lot this season. 4 million households faced utility disconnects last year, up 500,000 from the year before. Only 17% of eligible households get help with their heating or cooling. So where are we right now? The Senate is responding to the outrage, or did respond to the outrage of the nation of what they've seen in Minneapolis and elsewhere. They passed full-year appropriations bills for everything except the Department of Homeland Security, where there's a 2-week funding bill. During which time there needs to be a negotiation to rein in the thuggish, lawless, in some cases lethal behavior of these agents. The House has to act this week. Until they do, there will be a shutdown affecting health, housing, childcare, many other services. I'm not going to go through all of this because I know I'm running long. There are a lot of elements to the negotiation. Get ICE and the CBP, the Border Patrol agents out of our communities, conduct an investigation, drastically reduce funding, and have enforceable real limits on what they can do. Many examples. You can take action and join in if you go to that website, very easy to get to. Click on Take Action at the top. You can add your letters to your rep and senators. 350,000 sent so far, and if you add in related ones, we've done a little bit before, more than 500,000. So it's starting to work. Our fighting back against militarism, which has to happen with the domestic militarism and the Department of Defense. We're starting to get traction. Please sign up, join in so you can hear about more efforts as they happen. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Debbie, for the invaluable information and also for, making clear that the bombs that we drop overseas also fall at home. Martin Luther King made that so clear during the Vietnam War, and it's with us again. Let's open up the for some discussion before we move on to the focus on education. I see Judy Lord. Judy, you're muted. You have to unmute.
Hello, this is actually Paul George, not Judy Lord.
Okay, sorry.
I was muted. Robert Redwine, your opening statement was absolutely wonderful, but it was terribly garbled. There was a technical problem at the very, very end of the presentation. Would you be kind enough to read your opening statement again after everything is done?
I'm happy to if there's time, sure.
Yeah.
Can you
Let me
please try to
say,
make-
this is recorded, and we will send to everybody who's on this call the video.
I understand, but
Oh, I see. You
the recording will also be garbled. So
Gotcha.
please,
Gotcha.
please, Robert, make
All
time to
right.
do that. Thank you.
We can do that. We can do that. We'll just go a little long at the end, Bob. We'll bring you back on in the end.
Okay.
Henry.
Yes, I wrote in the chat, and the question is Reagan had that SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative. What is different about the Golden Dome? And from the Nuclear War book by Annie Jacobson, she says that there's only 44 interceptors by the US when we have 1,700 nuclear weapons by Russia alone.
Ted, you want to answer that?
Yeah, there is really no different. I mean, the Strategic Defense Initiative was, in terms of appearance, I want to underscore appearance, it was much more ambitious. Well, Golden Dome is pretty ambitious, but it was both Golden Dome and the Strategic Defense Initiative have absolutely no technical merit. I mean, it's just there was nothing behind it except a political vision, and this is a problem we have in the political leadership of the United States. There are people, and I might take this point since a lot of this group is based in Massachusetts. MIT, my university, was involved in covering up the absolute, clear, and unambiguous technical problems with the ground-based missile defense system. We had 3 presidents of MIT: Chuck Vest, Susan Hockfield, and Raphael Reif, all of whom, I want to be clear now, this is not just an emotional reaction, could properly be charged as criminals for their activity in lying to the Senate Armed Services Committee and other committees. And this is something I only point out now because there is a tendency in this group to point at the Republicans, who are certainly guilty. But I just want to point out that this is a bipartisan activity. I'll leave it there.
Absolutely. All right, I'm going to move on to the second part of this panel, and then we'll have more discussion after that. So, this lack of awareness of the role of the importance of the federal budget also affects understanding of the works of what seem to many people as totally local institutions, their local public schools, or their local college and universities. And so the cuts in the federal Department of Education, which have been led by Trump and his new Secretary of Education, Linda McMahon, formerly head of the Worldwide Wrestling Foundation, is often not appreciated. And our next 2 speakers will address these issues. First, we'll hear from Mia McIver, the executive director of the 55,000 member American Association of University Professors. She was a UCLA faculty. She led the 7,000 member union, American Federation of Teachers, and also led the University Council of the California Teachers Association in their organizing policy collective bargaining. And she will focus on the impact of recent events on higher education, and then will be followed by Eric Berg, president of the Boston Teachers Union, also vice president of the American Federation of Teachers of Massachusetts, and Massachusetts AFL-CIO, focusing a little more on K-12 education, and then we'll reopen the discussion. Mia, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you to Mass Peace Action for the invitation to be with all of you today. I'm thrilled to be part of this conversation. Also, really just extraordinarily happy to be on a panel with you, Eric, and to hear more about the exceptional work of BTU and your leadership. So my name is Mia McIver. I'm the Executive Director of the American Association of University Professors, or AAUP. And AUP in this moment is really galvanized by the idea that we must become a fighting union and we must mobilize higher ed workers nationwide to mount the strongest possible defense against the attacks that have been launched at us by the Trump administration. The attacks on higher ed long predated the second Trump administration. And I think in this present moment, I would especially date back to the spring of 2024, when student, staff, and faculty protesters were really subject to just horrible violence and subsequent restrictions on speech and expression on campuses nationwide. And that wave of crackdown on campus protests in 2024 really set the stage for where we are now. And the Trump administration has really driven a wedge into college campuses by exploiting a really absurd premise that college and university reparative initiatives are discriminatory. And the Trump administration has forced the closure of academic support and retention programs that have historically served underrepresented students. They have held billions in research dollars hostage and have weaponized it for their partisan aims. And what does that mean for us all here today? Well, first of all, it means that students on college campuses don't have access to the same robust education that they used to. But it also means that ordinary people nationwide are being robbed of therapies and cures that ordinarily are developed through university research pipelines. And so we're missing out on cures for diabetes, cures for heart disease, cures for Alzheimer's disease, and more. Because of the clinical trials that have been interrupted or just halted outright. In addition, dozens of college teachers across the country have been fired or otherwise disciplined for things that they've said in the wake of Charlie Kirk's murder. And loyalty oath compacts engineered by Federalist Society alum May Mailman and billionaire private equity vulture Mark Rowan. These loyalty oath compacts have illegally and unconstitutionally offered special treatment for colleges and universities that render ideological fealty to the Trump administration. So the good news here is that higher ed workers are organizing and higher ed workers are fighting back and higher ed workers are winning. We resoundingly defeated those Trump loyalty oath compacts. Not a single campus where they were offered agreed to sign on to them. But we are also really acutely aware that the Trump administration will continue to push its agenda through other means. And the current front in this battle right now is accreditation. And the Trump administration is seeking to take political control over accreditation bodies that basically establish college and university eligibility for student financial aid. And so I think what you can expect in the coming months is a real battle where the Trump administration accreditors say to colleges and universities, if you don't get on board with our agenda, then we will strip your institution and your students of all financial aid assistance. So the other thing that higher ed workers are fighting for in this moment is also ICE off campus, ICE out of Minneapolis, ICE out of Los Angeles, ICE out of Charlotte, ICE out of Portland. ICE out of Philadelphia, ICE out of College Station in Texas. Higher ed workers formed a very significant block of the protesters who have been marching in Minneapolis, and the statewide Minnesota formation of higher ed workers has been very impressive, very dedicated, and very courageous in the past several weeks. So that's a fight that higher ed workers are coalescing around in this moment. And I would say, generally speaking, faculty, staff, students have stepped into lead where presidents and governing boards have refused to. And we want to keep that momentum up. Currently, we're developing a policy platform that we will launch later this spring that is really aimed at communicating and implementing a vision for higher education that is transformed to serve the public interest. Because we have to play defense, we are playing defense. We're also not fighting simply to protect the previous status quo. We're fighting to move this sector forward according to our vision. And our vision means public reinvestment in higher ed federally and across all 50 states. That includes fighting for a college education that is free, that is regarded as a right, not as a privilege for elites only. That involves jobs with dignity, an end to adjunctification on our college campuses. It involves an end to student debt, and educational access and equity for students universally. So that's what we're fighting for in the moment. We're very happy to be fighting with many of you on this call today. We're also fighting in big, broad coalitional formations that include students, that include alumni, that includes faith groups and community groups, democracy groups, and civil society organizations. And our aim is to build a coast-to-coast and wall-to-wall movement that can leverage the real power necessary to transform higher education. And we're fighting in the courts, we're fighting in the media, we're fighting in the streets. And I do believe that we are going to win this vision and secure higher education. Thank you so much, and I'd be happy to have some follow-up conversation.
Thank you so much. It's good for the spirit to hear your voice. Let's move on now to Eric Berg from the Boston Teachers Union to talk more about the difficulties facing the K-12 public school world. Eric?
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. Thank you to all my fellow panelists and everybody for being here. And I have to say, when I was first approached about being on a panel about nuclear disarmament, I was sort of like, hey, boy, I don't know, that's not my area of expertise. But I'm very happy to be here, and I've learned actually quite a bit from the first panel, especially about the landscape on nuclear disarmament today. I grew up in Minneapolis, Minnesota, went to high school in the 1980s. And, as a kid, and I think this is probably true just looking at the screens for most people on this call, nuclear war was this ever-present threat. It was, when I was a kid, I was afraid of nuclear war and I was afraid of tornadoes. Those were my big fears. And I think as, the Cold War ended and things changed, that, and maybe I moved on to worrying about other things, I suppose, but it kind of faded from my mind, and it has started to come back in my mind. So I, sort of cut my teeth as an activist as a high school student in the 1980s on the nuclear freeze movement. It was really my first foray into activism, and I really so much appreciate the work of the people on this call for keeping the focus on the threats that nuclear weapons continue to pose to our world. But I'm not here to talk about nuclear weapons. I'm here to talk about K-12 education. I taught elementary school for 25 years, mostly second grade, and now I'm the president of the 11,000 member Boston Teachers Union. And I want to start again. I'm not talking about nuclear proliferation here. I want to start with big concepts about K-12 public education and what the institution of public schools mean to America and frankly to our world. Public education, public schools in America, at their best, are one of the very few venues where people of all backgrounds, of all races, of all social classes can come together. And because they are young people, it's even more important because this is the place that our future gets shaped because kids are learning to read and write, they're learning to think critically, they're learning STEM, they're learning to, compute and so forth. They're learning history and civics, and they're learning to get along with each other, to resolve problems in a democratic society. And if we get away from thinking of that as a public good, it's really going to be destructive for all of our communities. I saw in a previous slide that the Department of Defense budget is $997 billion, or it was, I guess, in FY24. So the budget for the U.S. Education Department is $79 billion. Of that, $45 billion goes to K-12. So there's such a tremendous benefit that we can get or could get from shifting the money that we're spending on missiles to money that we're spending on mines. That's perhaps an obvious benefit, but I also want to remind us, and Debbie's slide also alluded to this, that especially in this administration, it is the billionaire class and the leaders of large multinational corporations, often part of or at least adjacent to the military industrial complex, who are raking in billions of dollars for them and their families through tax breaks, through government contracts. And that is enabling the terror that this administration is inflicting on immigrant communities, on many of our cities, most notably Minneapolis and St. Paul these days. And that is affecting not only our country in every way, but our kids. And I think part of it is when young people grow up in a world where our foreign policy is based on bellicose rhetoric and threats backed up with arsenals bristling with missiles and shaking down weaker or poorer nations to take their territory. Kids internalize that. I mean, we all do. But I think bringing our foreign policy into a place where we are guided by the idea of community, where threats and disagreements are resolved through negotiation, that kind of morality trickles down to kids in a positive way, in the same way that the threats of war trickles down in a negative way. The other thing about growing up when I did, and I think many of us here shared that anxiety around civil defense drills, around the threat of nuclear war, and what kids are facing today are active shooter drills. Our kids are burdened with anxiety about the proliferation of guns. It is, I think, backed up with the proliferation of weapons. And I think what we've seen with social media, with the ready access to cell phones, and now the rise of artificial intelligence, without guardrails and in the hands of ruthless tech companies, is adding to that anxiety that our young people are facing. And all of that comes into our classrooms and schools. Kids right now are not okay. Their anxiety, their trauma is often externalized, and kids are acting in ways in classrooms that teachers are not used to, that their classmates are not used to, and they're not healthy. So I think in terms of unacceptable costs of nuclear proliferation, there is both the very basic and obvious one, which is if money we're not spending on missiles is resources that we could put into our classrooms. But then there is this idea of maybe the moral cost of how we are raising our children and the kinds of models that they see in the world. The federal government funds K-12 education largely through two major programs called Title I, which funds largely low-income schools, and IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which provides funding for students with disabilities. The Trump administration has cut many federal grant programs, but the two big ones have thus far remained intact, despite, I think, worries and that they will be cut or block granted, and probably intentions to do so. But thankfully, they've been held at bay because parents in red states and blue states want their kids to get a solid education. Parents in red states and blue states have children with disabilities, and they believe they deserve a free and appropriate public education. So I think it is up to all of us to prevent those in the Trump administration, including the president, who would love to eliminate federal funding for public education, to make sure that we stand up for public schools, whether we have children or grandchildren in our public schools now or not, but make sure that we let our representatives in Congress and in the Senate know that we believe in a strong public education system and that we ought to reinvest in our schools rather than in missiles. Again, thank you so much for this opportunity, and look forward to further conversation if there's time.
Thank you so much, Eric, for wise words. Just before we open up to a few questions, I just want to say to this audience, teachers are organized generally in every state in the union, either AFT, locals, or NEA affiliates, and faculty often in AAUP. But parents hardly ever have state organizations. And so, despite the fact that the AAUP, AFT, and NEA wants to work together with parents in defending public education, there is a real problem. But in the peace movement, many of our organizations, though education is hardly ever named as a focus, in fact, many of the members, many of you are parents, your grandparents, or your local peace action group has parents or grandparents. So we have an initiative through the Education Fund, Books Not Bombs, where we bring together peace activists who are sensitive to these needs about education with representatives of the teachers union, AAUP, to work for Books Not Bombs. And if any of you are interested in actually concretely joining that organizing efforts, we'll send a follow-up message out to everybody on this call saying, here's what to do if you're kind of interested in joining this Books Not Bombs efforts. It's being led by the teachers and the faculty, but desperately need parents and grandparents. All right, let me open it up briefly for a few minutes of question or comment. I see a hand, Lenore Sanders. Lenore.
Here I am. Thank you for calling on me. I have a lot to say, which obviously I can't get it all in. It would be really wonderful if all of the speakers and all the participants could somehow get together quite soon on all of these issues. I'm thankful for all of the speakers. What came as a surprise to me, which I'm very thankful for, is the focus on education and the focus on the destruction of necessary services. This is not just a U.S. problem, obviously. And I think it's very interesting that we're now in two worlds at the same time. We're on this, and I'm going to try to make this quick and ask my question because it is a question that I'd like addressed. but we are in two worlds. One world is the bricks and everything out of that is come into existence. The other is all the horrors that we see in the United States, which is a special slap in the face on the 250th anniversary of our Declaration of Independence. I put in two things, but the last thing that I put in was just very concrete. It was that I had a friend who passed away in 2019, Lyndon LaRouche, who would often say, money is an idiot. So I asked the question, and I believe that's true. I think that, if we don't have a Hamiltonian system, money doesn't mean a darn thing. So my question is, why are we continuing to equate the money spent on this or that war or what have you with the money to that should be going to the betterment of mankind? We need a new system is what we need. So I'd like people to address that.
Okay.
Thank you.
So that is a very, very large question. Unfair to ask particular speakers. We have it before us. Let me call on a couple other people. CM.
Yes, I was just saying that Mia McIver, when she spoke about what Trump has done to education, she probably missed saying what he has done also to foreign students. That he has discouraged foreign students to come to the United States to study, and now they're going to Australia and Canada and Europe, and so they're the ones who are beneficiary of all those new minds.
No, we certainly see that in the Boston area, very, very, very sharp attack on besides arresting them. Sharon, you had a chance to speak. Peter and Dan haven't. Peter and then Dan, and then we'll have to close it and move on. We'll continue to discuss as the conference proceeds. Peter.
Jonathan, first, my thanks to you and the other organizers of this for putting together a really great program, which so well captures the idea that we are robbing ourselves and our important interests in this militarism. I just want to say to those of the presenters like Eric Berg that some of us are paying regular visits to our congresspeople to try to persuade them to get on to do the kinds of things we're talking about here. And we would really love, Jonathan's probably already asked you, and so I want to add my urge that you join with us when we have those, when we can arrange those visits. And in fact, your presence would help us get more attention. So thanks.
Right.
Appreciate that. Definitely we should be in touch and happy to help.
Excellent.
Thank you, Eric.
Dan, you have the last word in this panel before we move on.
Oh, my goodness, I have never had the last word. So I'm struck by the fact that in Newton and probably other surrounding communities, there is a curriculum that discusses the problems of Israel and Palestine, and there are curricula that discuss issues of anti-Semitism and Holocaust and racism. And I'm struck by the fact that there is no curriculum that I know of that looks at nuclear disarmament or disarmament as a whole. And in particular, I'm encouraged to see that Eric Berg has been a part of the panel. And I wonder if there is some way to begin to introduce a curriculum into our high schools that looks at the issues of disarmament and the threat of nuclear weapons and the distortions on our military budget.
Thank you. That's such a good point. And I can't speak to the ins and outs of specific high school curricula, but what I can say is that really for the last 20 plus years, we have seen an attitude towards public K-12 education which has really narrowed the curriculum rather than broadened it and provided I think, and I think most educators believe, an overemphasis on things that are measurable, namely and largely standardized test scores, which for many students in many schools, particularly those that serve largely lower income communities, has narrowed the curriculum to such an extent that honestly, even history is taught minimally, and there's such an overwhelming focus on sort of basic literacy and math as judged by particular standardized tests that it has crowded out much of what can make high school, I think, at all levels, but particularly high school, attractive to many kids. And I think that would include things like specific learning on nuclear proliferation or non-proliferation. In Massachusetts, I know that this is sort of a Massachusetts-based event, but there's people from around the country. As you know, we recently eliminated MCAS as a graduation requirement, and it is our hope that that will open up opportunities for things like that in our high schools. So thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, let me say, Dan, this is a very active discussion in our Books Not Bombs group. And as Eric implies, things are going in the wrong way. The State Department of Secondary, DESE, and the Anti-Semitism Commission is moving to restrict the teaching of the Holocaust curriculum and make it much more difficult to get in things like peace curriculum. But we haven't given up. All right, this has been very, very valuable. Mia didn't mention that AAUP and AFT have a national campaign, First Fridays, that involve resisting this attack on public education. Its intermediate goal is on May Day when there'll be national rallies, and our Books Not Bombs committee is kind of representing some of the local groups, and you'll hear about it in follow-up emails. Mary Ellen, are you with us?
I think so.
Okay,
Hi.
let me pass the baton to you.
Very good. So hello, everyone. I'm Mary Ellen Kirkulis with Massachusetts Peace Action Ed Fund. And it's my pleasure to chair this session with three esteemed speakers who are going to talk about what possibilities there are for us to pressure Congress in order for them to take the lead and cut nuclear weapons spending, and certainly, extremely importantly, to extend START. It's my pleasure to introduce Daniel Hall. We will have three speakers, Daniel Hall, Larry Cohen, and George Beebe, after which we'll take some questions. And Daniel Hall is the lead Capitol Hill representative and faith community outreach coordinator for Back from the Brink, bringing communities together to abolish nuclear weapons. And in addition to his work in interfaith collaboration, he focuses on legislative advocacy and justice-centered solutions to nuclear disarmament. Take it away, Daniel.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It means more than I can say to see over 100 people, organizers, teachers, students, faith leaders, scientists, parents, all gathered because we believe something simple and profound. Human life is worth protecting. Every life, everywhere. My name's Danny Hall. I'm here in Washington, D.C. with Back from the Brink. And before we talk about policy or Congress or resolutions, I want to start with something deeper, something human. Every one of us in this room is here because at some point we realized that the world we've inherited is not the world we want to pass on. Maybe it was a news story, maybe it was a conversation with a child, maybe it was a moment of fear or a moment of clarity, but something in us said, this is not acceptable, this is not inevitable, and I have to do something. And that's the heartbeat of this movement. Back from the Brink has grown into a national force, thousands of advocates, hundreds of organizations, dozens of cities and towns. And let me be honest about where we are. Nuclear elimination is not yet part of the normalized policy debate in Washington. It's not shaping budgets. It's not driving hearings. It's not on the agenda of the Armed Services committees. And that is exactly why we are here. Our mission is to shift the Overton window to make elimination thinkable, speakable, and politically survivable. Because once something becomes speakable, it becomes debatable. And once it becomes debatable, it becomes winnable. We are the ones expanding the boundaries of what's possible. But let's talk about the world we're living in. The last major arms control treaty, New START, will soon expire. For the first time in decades, the world's two largest nuclear powers will be operating with no binding limits on their arsenals. There's open talk about resuming nuclear testing, something that would ignite a global arms race overnight. We are watching destabilizing technologies spread. Missile defense systems that encourage adversaries to build more weapons, weaponized satellites that threaten early warning systems, AI-driven command and control that compresses decision time, cyber vulnerabilities that make false alarms more likely. This is not stability. This is not safety. This is a world walking on a tightrope in the dark. It's a system held together by luck, and luck is not a security strategy. But for decades, we've been told a story that nuclear weapons keep us safe. But the truth is the opposite. Nuclear weapons are not our security. They are our greatest risk. Every day they exist, we live one miscalculation, one false alarm, one cyber breach, one human error, one irrational presidential decision away from catastrophe. And underneath the nuclear system is a deeper logic, a logic that says some lives are expendable, a logic that treats human beings as disposable. Because the federal budget that pours trillions into nuclear weapons that could end human civilization is the same budget cutting Medicaid, cutting food assistance, funding ICE raids, and telling millions of Americans that we can't afford basic human needs. We're told these weapons are for our safety, while the very people they claim to protect are left hungry, uninsured, and afraid. That is not security. That is moral failure. And that is why elimination is not idealism. It is survival. It is dignity. It is justice. And it is rationality. Because the world we built our nuclear assumptions on is gone. The post-Cold War nuclear security environment is not the environment we inhabit today. The technical knowledge, verification tools, and monitoring practices developed over decades of arms control remain essential, but they can no longer be the endpoint. They must become the scaffolding for building a new security architecture that reflects 21st century realities. And in that architecture, a world free of nuclear weapons is not an aspiration, but a long-term security necessity. Eliminating nuclear weapons is the only durable way to ensure lasting stability and prevent future nuclear crises. It's the only proportionate response to a world that is tightly wired as this, and this dangerously unpredictable. It's why elimination is strategic realism. And let me say something clearly about House Resolution 317 and Senate Resolution 323. These aren't just any resolutions. These are the back from the brink resolutions. They translate our platform into congressional language. They take the principles we've been organizing around for years and put them directly in front of Congress. They are the most comprehensive nuclear security resolutions currently in Congress. They are the most forward-looking because they do something Washington almost never does. They call for actively pursuing a world free of nuclear weapons as a national security imperative. Not a dream, not a slogan, a national security imperative. And here's the truth. The goal is not necessarily a floor vote tomorrow. That's not how movements work. These resolutions are organizing vehicles. They give people something to ask for. They give communities something to rally around. And they give members of Congress a safe way to step into leadership. Their purpose is to cultivate champions, to find the people who are ready to lead and help them grow into that leadership. And here's where we stand today. 47 members of Congress currently support House Resolution 317, and 9 senators support Senate Resolution 323. This is a foundation, and we're going to build on it. Our mission in 2026 is, 1, to bring many more members of Congress onto these resolutions. We want dozens more, and we can get them. And 2, push current co-sponsors to step up. We need them speaking publicly, recruiting colleagues, pushing committees, and making nuclear risk impossible to ignore. And that only happens when constituents create a steady drumbeat, a rhythm of engagement that says, we're here, we're watching, and we expect leadership. And because this is where today's event is hosted, a message to our friends in Massachusetts. Massachusetts, you have enormous leverage. Senator Elizabeth Warren, she's a co-sponsor, she cares, but we need her to be more public, more vocal, and more visible. Senator Ed Markey, a lifelong champion, but right now we need him to do something specific. Bring more senators onto Senate Resolution 323. He can do it, but he needs to hear from you. This movement grows when ordinary people take extraordinary action. So here's what you can do starting now. Adopt a member of Congress. Create a steady drumbeat. Bring 2 new people into this movement. Host something and tell your story. You don't need to be an expert, you just need to care and to act. So let me leave you with this. Every major movement in this country, civil rights, women's suffrage, marriage equality, was built by people who were told their goals were unrealistic, people who were told to wait, people who were told the system would never change. But they didn't wait. They organized, they built power, and they changed the political weather. And that is exactly what we are doing. We are not powerless in the face of nuclear weapons. We are powerful because we are many. We are powerful because we are persistent. And we are powerful because we believe deeply that every human life has value and none of us are disposable. So let's make 2026 the year we turn legitimacy into power and power into change. Let's invest in minds, not missiles, and let's build the future our communities deserve. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll hand it back to our moderator.
Thank you so much, Daniel. So we're going to move on to our second speaker. We'll open up the session for discussion at the end of the 3 speakers that we have. Larry Cohen is the former president of the Communications Workers of America. He represented 600,000 workers in both the US and Canada. And of course, we all know him, recognize him as the board chair of Our Revolution, which is the successor organization of the 2016 Bernie Sanders presidential campaign. I certainly remember, as many of us do. And let's see, he's now, did I say he is board chair of Our Revolution, and all of his life, or most of his adult life, he's been a member, organizer, and officer of CWA. So we're really excited to hear from you, Larry. Take it away.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to try to wrap together what several speakers have said into what I was going to say. So if we go back to, and I'll do it quickly, if we go back to Bill Hartung at the very beginning, he said, how do we make this movement, the movement, we could call it for nuclear disarmament or to freeze or cut back the military spending, how do we make it part of a broader movement, the kind of coalition that could give new imagination to what our nation might be? And in my view, that's the core for all of us. So yeah, for me, most of my life was, workers' rights, union organizing, fighting for a 21st century labor law that actually was in step with the rest of the world. But my own origins were in the later part of the anti-war movement, civil rights movement, and I always believed that for any of us, it has to be a broader political strategy that's based on issue organizing. So whether it's back from the brink or a Medicare for all, healthcare organizing, or education organizing, as we heard from the AUP and Boston Teachers Union. The real question is, number one, within our own sort of silo, how do we go deeper, as we just heard from back from the brink and Daniel? How do we go deeper around that core issue that brings us all here today? But then it's also, how do we build that broader coalition? And it's that political strategy is what, Jonathan has asked me to talk about. And I've always been glad to be on these calls because of what I learned, frankly, much more than what I say. And particularly today, in terms of the total fallacy of these trillion-dollar programs, like a new round of nuclear tactical weapons, or ICBMs, or Golden Dome. It's quite amazing to hear that they're really the product of the military-industrial complex and the contractors, much more than they are of any kind of defense scheme. And I also thought that Debbie Weinstein's presentation is really key, because in this moment, the trigger about military spending right now is Homeland Security, ICE. That's the tip of the spear for all of us. And so how do we put this together? If the tip of the spear is Minneapolis and ICE and murdering civilians and deporting lawful residents, how do we go from that to the nuclear weapon, tragedy, horror show, to this broader coalition? And what's the political strategy of that? And the problem is that gets complicated. So, in essence, Jonathan said to me, talk more again about because I've been on other calls here, about the Congressional Progressive Caucus, how it can grow, the Democratic primary fights, particularly in the House, and how that is part of this overall strategy. So I will take a few minutes to do that. But before we even get to that, the broader strategy on top of that, really, starting from those issues and the coalition of issues, is number one, building a party within the party. And that is an example of that is the CPC, Congressional Progressive Caucus, and its Political Action Committee. And then within the Senate, because of or stemming from, I should say, the latest fight, the shutdown in the fall, those who wanted to hold that wall, about 6, 7, 8 senators were working together all the time. They don't really have a name like the CPC, but it's people like Warren, who was mentioned here, and Merkley, and of course, Bernie, and 5 or 6 more. And they sort of fluctuate. And they are aiming at the reorganization of the Senate next year, and hopefully a different leadership in the Senate. And in the House, the CPC is very much focused on trying to build to a majority around the human needs issues, hopefully including a military freeze in the end of the tactical nuclear weapons and idiotic programs, trillion-dollar programs like Golden Dome. And then there's the sort of the outer edge of that movement is really outside the Democratic Party. And it would be independents running for office where that makes sense, where it's not a spoiler event, but it's an ennobling event. It's an enabling event, sorry. And there are examples of that. And I saw someone in the chat talk a bit about that as well. And we remember that in most states, There are more unaffiliated. They don't register as independents. They're not affiliated. There's more unaffiliated voters than there are in either party. So that strategy, at the minimum, progressive Democrats aligning with unaffiliated is the key to electing the kind of people that would support books, not bombs, to use our title here. And then within the House and Senate, in terms of today's discussion, and it's been mentioned, there's two key committees, Armed Services and Homeland Security. So the military spending, as we've talked about today, is in both of those committees, and it comes together in the only part of our budget beside the debt and servicing the debt that's expanding are what's coming out of those two committees. So part of the political strategy is, can we get champions in those committees, Armed Services and Homeland Security, in both the House and Senate? And how do we take our coalition with the content today as a key part of it and put enough pressure on people, say like a Ro Khanna, who I happen to work with a lot, or a Bernie Sanders, or Elizabeth Warren, or Jeff Merkley. But in the House, Pramila Jayapal, she chairs the Congressional Progressive Caucus Political Action Committee. For the last 4 years, until this year, she chaired the actual caucus. Now that's Greg Tassar, Ilhan Omar. There's about 50 core members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus in the House. There's 50 others. Without being too cynical, they're there so that the caucus doesn't endorse an opponent in a primary in their district. So there are 100 or so members, but I would say, I can say that here. I would say that really anywhere. Half of them, are not progressive in any meaningful way, at least in terms of what we're talking about here today. But the positive would be half of them are, and how do we expand that? And then we get down to the rules. And I like to say in any talk really that I give or in any audience, it's the rules, not just the rulers. So when we talk about our political strategy, yes, the issues are what we love. The issues are for the people we love. The issues are what motivate us. And those silos, again, like back from the brink, we've got to build them or we're going to have nothing. We've got to come in coalition or we're going to not win. We also have to look at the rules or we're not going to win. So most famously, we would all say in a minute, 15, 16 years ago, Citizens United was a disaster for everything that we love. But this year, a project that I'm very involved in, I'm only mentioning it because I think it involves us all, is to get the dirty money out of the Democratic primaries so that we can elect progressive Democrats to support our issues in the Democratic primaries. And with that money that dirty money, the corporate and dark money that defeated a number of our best candidates last year in 2024, 2 years ago, and is coming back in droves this year. It's crypto, it's APAC. This year, it's going to be artificial intelligence companies and their PAC and the way they operate. And so that rule, we actually got the Democratic National Committee to pass a resolution, still has to get implemented, that in 2028 in the presidential primaries, no corporate money, independent expenditures, no dark money, independent expenditures. But that's only in the presidential and it's not implemented yet. So we still are organizing. I'm on the DNC. We still have that fight. But more importantly, every state party should be taking on that fight. And yes, political parties are private organizations and they can regulate their nominating process and they can penalize or eliminate candidates that benefit from corporate dark money and other independent expenditures. Elizabeth Warren actually did a pledge in 2012 with Scott Brown, their Republican opponent, and they blocked that money in their own election because the two of them agreed. So I could talk more about it. We don't have time. But the dark money, the dirty money in the primaries is preventing us from getting Democrats. And most House districts are single-party Democratic districts And so the primary is the only election, and that money floods into those districts. Cori Bush defeated last year. Sushila Jayapal in Portland, Oregon, defeated last year by that money, and many, many more. And then similarly to that, on the Senate side, we've come close to this before, but failed by a couple of votes. We've got to eliminate cloture, initial cloture, if not the whole filibuster process. But we often talk about the filibuster. The key is really initial cloture. If we don't get rid of initial cloture, these resolutions, whether it's back from the brink or anything else, they don't get to the floor because they need 60 votes. When in any other democracy, they only need a majority, either 50 if we have the BP or 51. And there's other rules as well that are in our way from the kind of world and the kind of country that we want. So we've got to put together, the deeper work on our issue. We'll use back from the brink. It's the key issue in terms of what brings us together today. We've got to work in coalition, bringing together, not too many, but 5 to 10 at the most issues for this party within the party that they coalesce around, that we hold them accountable and demand that they're there. We've got to push for candidates in those Democratic primaries that get elected for the first time based on that coalition. We've got to push for change inside the party. While we fight on Citizens United, the party is guilty of this. The party, like Massachusetts Party, will take the money from anywhere. And the candidates in Massachusetts, like a Richie Neal, who's the ranking member of Ways and Means, I don't think he's running again, finally. But the money he has taken from the military-industrial complex for years makes it clear that he'll never be with us on the issues we were here to talk about today. So I'm going to stop there. And as I always say, this is hard, but it's never hopeless. People in tougher fights than ours in this country and in others have resisted. They fought back. And often in these darkest moments is when transformative change can occur. And I'm certainly confident that if we stick together and work together, we can accomplish that. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. We're next going to go. I was actually informed that our final speaker for this session is Joe Gerson. Jonathan, I will alert you that we're a bit over time, so I don't know if rather than taking a question segment after this, I switch over directly to Susan. What do you advise? You're muted. Yeah. You're muted, Jonathan, but I think you nodded.
I was saying, after Joe, let's go on to the last panel.
Okay. So it's my pleasure to introduce Joe Gerson, who is the president of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security. He is also vice president of the International Peace Bureau and, in fact, on the board of directors of Massachusetts Peace Action. He's played a leading role in building collaborations among U.S., Asian, and European peace and nuclear weapons abolition movements, and he was, in fact, the lead organizer for something a lot of us attended for the Intersectional World Conference on Nuclear Disarmament, Climate, Peace, and Justice back in 2015. So with that, let me turn it over to Joe.
It looks like I have something like the last word. Truthfully, I wish I could preach like Danny Hall. But I want to thank all of you who have held in and will be taking action on what you've been learning today. Before turning to the urgency of saving the New START Treaty and its limits and other cornerstones of the 60-year-old disarmament, arms control regime, I need to take a moment to agree with Larry Cohen that Minneapolis and resisting the ICE brown shirts is the tip of the spear for what we all need to be addressing. And that we need to think and act in very hard terms and with clear eyes about what must be done to overcome the corruptions of our political system. That said, I want to be clear that moving Gestapo Greg Bovino out of Minneapolis was a Trump administration costume change as the assaults on constitutional democracy and immigrants are grinding on. The good news is that at least 3,000 300 no ICE demonstrations were held across the country today, including in Boston. Then, the disconnect between the government and the rest of us is not only related to ICE and Border Patrol workers and brutal deportations. Perhaps most dangerously, there is a massive gap between Trump and many in Washington over arms control and preventing nuclear war as well. A recent YouGov poll tells us that 72% of Americans want to retain the U.S.-Russian nuclear weapons deployment limits, and 87% of voters want the U.S. to respect limits on the deployment caps, and 81% want new arms control negotiations. So we are the majority, even if we're struggling against illegitimate power. Nuclear arms control actually dates to the Kennedy administration and to the McCloy-Zorin agreement negotiated at the height of the Cold War, which also indicates that things are possible even with the new Cold War. The McCloy-Zorin agreement served as the foundation for future arms control negotiations, for a limited test ban, for the SALT I and II treaties, for the NPT, and the START treaties. But truthfully, this is not an unalloyed tradition. Often negotiations resulted in unspoken agreements about the realm in which the next arms race would take place. But until now, it has mostly been worth the ride. Today, three foundations of restraints on renewed and unlimited arms races, and thus human survival, lie in the balance. First, the New START Treaty, as Bill Hartung and Ted Postal explained, is in great danger. Second, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty is under threat. And as a result, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is widely understood as the cornerstone of all arms control diplomacy, is threatened to be unraveled. We face expiration of New START Treaty on February 5th, just a few days from now. It was negotiated during the Obama administration and limits the U.S. and Russia to deployment of 1,550 strategic nuclear warheads each. Just a few of those could end all life on Earth as we know it. The terms of that treaty dictate that it cannot be renewed. And for the past year, with new technological developments, there's been recognition that there hasn't been enough time to negotiate a replacement treaty. However, even at this last minute, there is no prohibition on extending the essential limits of the treaty if the treaty itself can't be renewed. And while there is no denying that Russia's brutal war of aggression in Ukraine, we also need to acknowledge that this past September, Putin proposed extending the treaty's essential limit. Trump responded then that it would be a good idea, but since then, the response from the Trump administration has been silence. Trump is not the only obstacle in Washington. Republican House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Brian Most and Europe Subcommittee Chairman Keith Sell argue that, quote, the New START Treaty not only advances meaningful arms control with the Russian Federation, no longer advances meaningful nuclear arms control with the Russian Federation, and it does not contribute to the broader goal of international nuclearization. One factor in the nuclear establishment's thinking now is that with China having about 600 nuclear weapons and being on its way for nuclear parity, there is pressure to expand the U.S. arsenal in order to fight and deter both China and Russia simultaneously. This in addition to the global dome. The Heritage Foundation's Project 2025, Marching Orders for Trump 2.0, called for massive increases in the U.S. arsenal to match and overwhelm the Russian and Chinese numbers. Such a buildup would unleash an untethered and extremely dangerous escalation of the nuclear arms race, not unlike what we had in the 1950s and 60s. We can also learn from the Arms Control Association that in powerful congressional circles, there is widespread belief that Trump's Golden Dome missile defense system, an unworkable boondoggle for the military-industrial complex, as we heard, that it could bankrupt the United States, but it is seen by them as replacing the need for arms control. In the relatively near term, we face the probability of the U.S., followed by Russia, increasing their number of deployed warheads by uploading more warheads onto existing missiles. Neither of them can do it immediately, but it's something that we should unfortunately expect if the elements of New START can't be extended. The dangers of falling into failing to extend the nuclear START limits is rivaled by Trump's threat to renew nuclear weapons testing. The comprehensive test ban, which outlaws all explosive nuclear tests, was negotiated during the Clinton administration. Recognizing that he and successive presidents have not had the necessary 67 votes to ratify the treaty, the U.S. is not among the 187 nations that have ratified the treaty, but China hasn't either. With the exception of North Korea, however, the U.S. and the rest of the world's nations have abided by the testing limits. Yet in November, probably confused about reports of Russia testing a nuclear-powered missile, not a warhead, Trump pledged that the United States would, quote, test nuclear weapons like other countries do. When asked about it, he doubled down on his testing threat. The truth is that the Nevada test site does not have the technology to renew new testing. Preparations to do so could take up to 3 years. But to fulfill his need to intimidate and to dominate, Trump could easily order the detonation of a nuclear warhead. If Trump's threat is not walked back or clarified before this April's Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, it would further undermine that third seminally important treaty and fuel current pressures for countries from Sweden and Poland to South Korea and Japan, who fear the loss of U.S. extended deterrence, the nuclear umbrella, that may move them to become nuclear weapons states. We will need to watch what Trump proposes in his Pentagon spending bill to see if he and his team will actually move toward renewal of testing. Just to look at the relationship between testing here and funding education, healthcare, and so on. There is the reality, unfortunately, that abandoning New START limits and the possible resumption of testing will accelerate the unraveling of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The NPT went into effect in 1972 when there were fears that as many as 50 countries could develop nuclear weapons arsenals. It rests on 3 legs. Non-nuclear countries forswear becoming nuclear powers, but they have the right, secondly, to generate nuclear power for peaceful purposes, which is a flaw in the treaty. And third, the original, I think as David Boris said earlier, the original nuclear powers pledged in Article 6 to engage in good faith negotiations for the complete elimination of their nuclear arsenals. The P5, US, Britain, Russia, France, and China, have resisted implementing their commitments or fulfilling their agreements made in past NPT review conferences, especially 13 agreements reached in 2010. It was this resistance to fulfilling their treaty obligation, NPT treaty obligation, that angered the majority of the world's non-nuclear weapons states and led to negotiation of the countervailing force of the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, something that I trust and hope people on this in this meeting are aware of or will learn about. The truth is that respect and trust for the NPT is dangerously diminishing as a result of the resistance of the nuclear powers. The last 2 NPT review conferences ended in what were experienced as failures. In the tradition of 3 strikes and you're out, if this April and May's review conference also fails, it seems likely that we can anticipate that some nations, further motivated by Trump's questionable commitments to U.S. allies, will gradually withdraw from the treaty and develop their own nuclear arsenals. And with proliferation, we have the growing danger of nuclear war. All of this, augmented by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists' call for action, increases the imperative of campaigning for the extension of New START limits and beyond. In the next few days, people can support the ad hoc coalition initiated by the Arms Control Association with the Friends Committee on National Legislation, Win Without War, the Nuclear Threat Initiative, and others who are pressing for New START extension with Congress. This must include Republicans. And as we highlight the contradiction of Trump's earlier commitments to denuclearization and respecting the deployment limits with his inaction of New START extensions, we have some openings. And should we lose the New START limits, it will be time to demand negotiations for the extension of those limits while Moscow abides by them, as Ted Postol was telling us, and actually for negotiation of a new treaty that addresses the complex and compounded threats that come with what we anticipate as the integration of nuclear, AI, and cyber warfare capabilities. Imagine AI controls of nuclear launch systems. A final word. To reduce the nuclear danger, we're going to have to oust Trump. The Pulitzer Prize journalist Cy Hirsch recently drew comparisons between Nixon's last insane and drunken days when he faced Watergate impeachment with our increasingly isolated, desperate, and unhinged nuclear monarch. We have to be sure that as he goes down, Trump can't take us all with him. So thank you for your attention. I hope to have communicated here is the absolute urgency of the need to reverse the arms race and to save our neighbors, which is deeply related to that, and to ousting our illegitimate government. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joseph. And we're very grateful since you're deeply involved in organizing movement mobilization for this the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in April. So given we are quite a few minutes behind, I apologize to our audience. We're going to continue with the presentations, and I'm going to turn it over now to Susan Mirsky, who will chair the final session. Susan, let me get you up here on the screen. Well, let's see. Maybe Cole, maybe you can help me out here. There we go. Go ahead, Susan.
Hi, just having a little bit of computer difficulties, but welcome everybody to this last panel. And I know we are absolutely over time, so I hope you can all just bear with us and stay on for this last wonderful panel. And of course, I lost my notes, so they were all about who is going to be on this panel. Well, we know who's going to be on this panel, but all the bios. So I'm going to ask people to sort of introduce themselves. We're here talking about the voices for peace and justice. And first on our list, we have Aaron Scott. Aaron Scott from the Cairo Center. So, Aaron, sorry, I don't have all of the information to introduce you, but welcome. And I just want to interject that here in the Boston area, in Massachusetts, not just Boston, in Massachusetts, we have a Poor People's Campaign that's active. And, we've got some wonderful people on it, like Jenny Bonham Carter, who does theomusicology. So people in Massachusetts and wherever you are, please look up the Poor People's Campaign and get involved. Aaron, let us know about you.
Thank you so much, Susan. And the Poor People's Campaign is all the introduction I need, so I appreciate that. My name's Erin. I'm here with the Cairo Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice. We're a national organization. We're committed to building a movement to end poverty that is led by the poor ourselves. We look to our study of history to show us why the poor have to be front and center at all of these most pressing issues that we're talking about. We also look to our faith traditions as evidence of the efficacy and the moral necessity of the leadership of the poor. And I guess just to make it a little personal, I'm a third generation organizer. Awesome to hear the other labor organizers on here. My grandma was an immigrant organizer who was interrogated by the feds under suspicion of communist activity during the McCarthy era. My mom was a grievance chair for an affiliate of the AFT. And I am a single parent with a child in a Title I public elementary school. And I also come from a military family, but the only, I guess, army allegiance I can claim is the army that Dr. King called for, which is a nonviolent army of the poor. Um, I think the most salient point, an intersection of my life with militarism is that I was raised in part by my grandparents, and um, in in 2013, my grandfather, who is a military veteran, died by suicide because it was easier for him to secure access to a firearm than to the mental health care that he so desperately needed. And it was other poor and working people who showed up for us in that moment, right? Um, in community after community where I have organized, it is other poor and working people who are showing up to save one another in times like this. And I think looking for leadership in poor communities is something we really got to train ourselves to do, because as horrifying and impactful as this moment is for all of us, we're going to have to figure out how to keep sticking it out, right? Keep sticking it out even though we cannot see a way forward, even though we're terrified. And that's what poor folks have to do every single day. Folks have already shared a lot of really salient data here. So I'm not gonna dump more numbers on you too much, but we found in the Poor People's Campaign in our audit of the United States, 50 years after Martin Luther King's first Poor People's Campaign, 50 years later, there's 140 million people in this country who cannot afford a $400 emergency. That's almost half the country. That's a data point from before COVID. We know that numbers are much worse now. And so when you think about the moral imperative here, as well as the strategic imperative, Jesus is always calling folks to feed and shelter and visit the incarcerated, care for the sick. And folks are like, when did we not do that for you? And he says, whenever you didn't do it for the least of these. Today, we have heard again and again on this webinar that the least of these are most of us, right? The least of these are most of us. Our communities are being bankrupted by militarism. We're paying for the government to turn on us, right? We're being stripped. Our schools are being stripped of resources. Our healthcare is being gutted, and all of that money is then being turned and aimed directly back at poor and working class communities. Um, I think the witness of King is really clear here. Other folks have pointed to this, but the quote in particular from 1967, where he says, "The dispossessed of this nation across racial lines live in a cruelly unjust society, and they must organize a revolution against the injustice, not against the lives of the persons who are their fellow citizens, but against the structures through which the society is refusing to take means which have been called for and which are at hand to lift the load of poverty." King said there are millions of poor people in this country who have very little or even nothing to lose. And if they can be helped to take action together, they will do so with a freedom and a power that will be a new and unsettling force in our complacent national life. I know we're short on time, so I think I'll just do two more points, right? I know it's hard to think about folks who are really most hard pressed, most directly impacted, being the leaders of our movements, right? Because things are so hard, and also because we haven't been trained to look downward for leaders, right? We've always been trained to look upward, but we're seeing this breakthrough and these struggles all over the country, right? Folks locked in detention centers, still protesting. And I think back to Frederick Douglass' speech about the Dred Scott decision. If folks don't remember that case, right, it's still today, even with the Supreme Court that we have today, legal scholars cite this as the worst ruling in U.S. Supreme Court history. The Dred Scott decision, of course, said Black folks were never intended to be covered by citizenship in this country. And so that ruling felt like a death blow to the abolitionist movement, right? Um, and Frederick Douglass had to find something to say when that ruling came down prior to the Civil War. Abolitionists were like, it's over. It's time to pack it up and go home. And among the words that he shared coming out of the Dred Scott ruling, Frederick Douglass said this. He said, oppression, organized as ours is, will appear invincible up until the very hour of its fall. I think I'll leave you with that. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Aaron, for those powerful words. And this panel is really about action. It's about what happens to all of us and how we can get involved. So thank you very much, Aaron. Our next speaker is Ben Cohen. Can we put him on the screen? Can we highlight him? Ben, thank you so much, Ben. I think you all know Ben Cohen. You know who he is, and he's going to introduce himself in a second. I just want to say, Ben, I saw you exactly last year on a panel at the TPNW conference, and it was on arts and activism, I believe. And
that was
yeah, that was great. But today, Ben will be talking about cutting that military budget, cutting the budget, and he will be talking about his Up in Arms campaign. So, Ben, Up in Arms.
All right. Yeah, good to be here with everybody. The Up in Arms campaign is kind of the same campaign we've all been campaigning on for God knows how long. But Up in Arms has positioned it that the American dream is no longer attainable, and the reason why it's not is because they've taken all the money that we ought to be using so that we could get houses or health care or child care and spent it on all these weapons. I think that we are living in a time when there's a lot of opportunities. It's a target-rich environment. Trump has done a few things for us. One, he has finally ripped the mask off the Department of Defense and rightly has renamed it the Department of War. I think people don't like war. People like defense. And now that we're calling it what it is, telling it like it is, I think it's a real opening for our movement to focus on the idea that it's all those 800 bases around the world are not about defending the U.S. They're about preparing for war around the world. I think a big part of the reason why we tend not to make that much headway, why the government has not listened to reason, is because people, the average people, regular old people that are struggling to get by, regular old people that are, just trying to take care of their kids and pick them up from school and keep the car running and keep the roof from leaking. They're not realizing that the reason why they're in such bad straits is because all of the money that should be going to them is being used to build these weapon systems that, don't work or are totally excessive in terms of the defense needs of the United States. So I think a big part of what we need to do is to make people aware of that. I've been working like the rest of you on this issue for so many decades, and pretty much the most effective things that I've done is this Oreo demonstration that shows what the federal budget is in comparison to where you compare the departments to each other. And I think a big part of the problem is that when people hear about these budgets, they take them up one at a time. And so, all right, we got the $1 trillion defense budget. Should we do that? Should we not do it? And then after that, there's, maybe some talk about the education budget, but they never put them together. And so people don't understand that the reason why my school budget is always in the red, why we got to cut teachers, etc., is because the federal government has decided to use your money to prepare to kill people just like you, in some other country, as opposed to funding your schools. And so one thing that Trump has done is that he's given us the name the Department of War, which doesn't sell near as much as the Department of Defense. And the other thing he's done for us is to come up with this idea that, the Pentagon budget should not really be based on what we need to defend the country. It should be based on a number that he picks out of the air. So, he plussed it up to $1 trillion without having any ideas to what he was going to spend it on. And now he's talking about plussing it up another 50% to 1.5 trillion. And it's interesting. I mean, you got the weapons manufacturers saying, geez, I don't know if we can figure out how to spend that much money that quick. But to me, for him to say that, okay, I think we can find another $500 billion, another 500 billion. And the first thing he thinks about is, let's put it into the Department of War budget. It puts that $500 billion in play. And it allows us to say, what else could you do with that $500 billion? And man, you can't believe what we could do with $500 billion. I mean, for $40 billion, you could provide food security for everybody around the world who's starving, including the people here in the U.S. I mean, that's just 40 billion. So I think, another part of what our movement needs is to be able to paint a picture of what the world could be like, say 10 years after we spent 30 or 40 or 50% of the Pentagon budget on the things that people really care about and want and are thinking about every day.
Ben, I'm just going to interject, and I'm so sorry to be able to have to do this because I know we're so short on time. Up in Arms campaign, can you tell us about how the Up in Arms campaign addresses all of those very important things that you've just been talking about?
We've been using the same methodologies that the rest of the movement has been using. It's PR, it's social media. Recently, I think it was yesterday. I shot an infomercial for the Golden Dome Colander Company, and we're essentially saying that Trump's dome is never going to work because it's got all these holes in it, and that was actually a fantasy. But we've taken fantasy and turned it around into reality. We are selling Golden Dome colanders great for draining whatever you want. They've got a lot of holes in them, and we love the holes. And they're actually for sale, and they're engraved. And it says Golden Dome Colander on it. And, it's actually an heirloom. It's a thing that you can hand down from generation to generation. And all of us grandparents need to be concerned because if we don't buy a Golden Dome Colander and it doesn't get handed down to our grandkids, and our grandkids' friends have friends whose parents did buy the Golden Dome Colander and they've got one, and our grandkids don't, our grandkids going to be some pissed off and cursing us out. So you got to go to goldendomecolanders.com and get your golden colander. So we're focusing on the Golden Dome, and we're in the process of building a fountain that'll be installed in DC that has Trump holding up this golden dome, and there's water coming on the top of the dome, and there's holes in it, and he's getting all wet. And it's the idea of ridicule, that ridicule cuts through, and I think people understand it much better. And by the way, I saw that Ted Postal is here. I met with Ted, I don't know, a month ago or so, and we were talking about the Golden Dome, and he's our scientific advisor, of course, and he talked about this idea that the only test they've been able to do for Star Wars, or the new version now, is they claim they've had successful tests, and the only time they can have a successful test is when they tell the interceptor exactly where the target is going to be. And Ted says, that's like taking some chickens and strapping them down in order to cut their heads off. And I had 3 rubber chickens when I was on the set shooting our Golden Dome commercial, and I did channel Ted and had my hatchet out, and we did chop the heads off 3 chickens.
Thank
So
you. Yeah.
it's that kind of thing that
Okay.
that we're
Well,
doing.
Thank you so much, Ben. And let us know about these efforts and and what you're doing so that we can augment them. And thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, in about a month, you can go to upinarms.life and you can get your very own Golden Dome Colander.
Thank you very much for your efforts. Thank you, Ben Cohen. And now we're going to switch to Paul Shannon. And Paul, is Paul here?
Yeah.
Paul, there you are. Let's spotlight Paul. And we, as this part again is on, let's do the spotlighting, is on organization, what we can do, voices for change, voices for peace. And I am so pleased to introduce Paul Shannon, who is my fellow comrade in action and organizer extraordinaire. He's the chair of the, let's see, Paul, why don't you tell us some of those things you're doing, and then about organizing, because I think people want to know how you do it, and, in very specific areas, because we want to get going.
Okay, well, those of us who've been interested in peace for 50, 60 years now or more, have a lot of work, have a lot of work to do. But here at Mass Peace Action, of course, we're organizing on Gaza. We're organizing to try to prevent nuclear war in Ukraine. We're trying to deal with the invasion of Venezuela. And now, given Trump's emergency decree that Cuba presents an immediate and dangerous threat to the national security of the United States, he has decided deliberately to starve as many Cubans as he can possibly, and even to consider a naval blockade of Cuba to make sure people starve, and hopefully they will overthrow their government for us. So it's quite a dangerous situation we face. But as we look out there, I think we see that Trump's war against the United States and his war against the whole world is in fact helping create a coalition for us in which more and more people start to see the connections of these issues, not just theoretically, but when they see these ICE agents stomp into different parts of the country and just exercise cruelty that we never thought was imaginable. We can see how tactics we've used overseas and the justifications we've given for those invasions and destruction of other countries have come home. And of course, they've always come home in the area of budget cuts and sending the money to the military, whether it's for nuclear weapons or these horrendous other weapons of mass destruction. That these have always been connected to, to what's happening in education, what's happening in housing, what's happening in healthcare. But now I think we're seeing more and more how these different issues do come together on a more of an emotional basis. And I'm hoping that will create a possibility of us working together at levels that we have not been able to before, as we have all these silos that we're trying to deal with and break down in an effective way that doesn't just destroy the silos, but creates something much more powerful. We're not there yet. We lack the messaging and the inspiration that is needed to bring more and more people, a critical mass around together to fight for these things together. But that's where we're going. But I've been asked to talk about an effort here in Massachusetts that was inspired by Mary and Sarah in Western Massachusetts to bring groups that were originally focused on trying to prevent the invasion and attack on Venezuela together into a statewide network that will be able to coordinate together on issues of militarism, starting with Venezuela. This week, it's going to have to switch to Cuba. In the past, of course, if you talked about Cuba, it didn't seem to be connected with a lot of these other things, poverty and billionaires running our electoral system and all that type of thing. But I think more and more these types of issues we're starting to feel that they are connected. But this network is very, very simple. We have an organized group in Western Mass, another in Central Mass, and another in Eastern Mass. Total of maybe 120, 130 activists that have started to meet and will certainly try to organize activities in a lot of different areas in their own area, but also create the possibility of coordinated actions across the state. And so I think that's mainly why I'm here, is to talk about that. Like I said, this network started off with a focus on trying to prevent what's happened in Venezuela. However, in the first meeting of all these activists, and they developed a platform which starts with the issue of Venezuela and Latin America, but then it also talks about ending the ICE occupation of our communities. In fact, many of the people that started working on Venezuela are now working primarily on ICE and ending that atrocity going on right before our eyes. But two parts of the this agenda that the statewide network developed are most relative for today, I think. The first is no wars at home and no wars abroad. That opens up a whole bunch of possibilities of areas that we could coordinate statewide. And then the last one, of course, is the theme we've heard through this meeting today: money for jobs, housing, education, healthcare at home. And so we'll have to see what the possibilities are for this new network. I think I just, at this stage, just want to alert people that that it exists and that it can be built on. And if people want to get involved in this, that would be, to let us know here at Mass Peace Action, and we'll try to integrate you into that effort. At our meetings, we will decide at each time what are the main thrusts of our activity, and hopefully start to bring some of these incredibly important issues that have been talked about today. I mean, can you just imagine, in terms of the Poor People's Campaign, the impact that $1 trillion military budget, what that actually means on the ground for low-income people? I mean, people that are pretty much invisible, given the way our media and our presentation of reality in this country is set up. These are devastating amounts of money that are being robbed from people. It won't be budget issues alone, however, that will be necessary to convince people to join us, but rather a vision that I think Aaron talked about, that we had once we had with leaders like King and others like that could present a positive vision of what our country and our world could be like. Unless we find something like that that inspires people to get active, because they truly feel that they can turn this world and our country into a better place, into a place with justice, a place where people respect each other, a place where we're able to talk to each other, and really develop a real solidarity among us, whatever we're working on at a particular time, and create the opportunity by using that overall vision to bring us together around a whole bunch of these different issues that we can address strategically. We can't do everything at once. There are certain times that certain activities are offer the most possibility, and then other times other ones come into the forefront. But to see all this as a movement brought together by that vision, and I'm hoping that this statewide network might make some type of at least small contribution to pulling that together.
Paul, thank you so much. And I hope that this whole conference, all the speakers in every single panel, and those of this last panel will help us have that kind of vision. We may not have Dr. King right now. We have his words, but we have the words of everybody who participated today. And we have the thinking and the responses of everybody who participated, who came to this conference, to go forward with our voices of peace, our voices for action, our voices for change, to make a better world. So I want to thank you all for being here today, for sticking it out this for extra time. And again, to know that it will all be recorded. And again, thank you so much. So peace and action and change from all of us. Thank you.
Amen.